Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Paul Saladino is a classically trained MD as well as a functional medicine practitioner. He received his MD from the University of Arizona in 2015 and as an IFMCP as well. He went on to residency at the University of Washington in psychiatry, and his interests include the autoimmune basis of psychiatric illness, connections between the microbiome and mental health, and nutritional biochemistry. So he's a very smart dude. In his practice, he is passionate about understanding and correcting the roots of disease. And most recently, Paul has taken an interest in the carnivore diet as an intervention for health. Welcome to the show, Paul. Stoked to have you.
Hey, it's great to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've listened to a ton of shows with you and followed you on Instagram, and I'm a huge fan of your work. And one thing I was curious about is you have so many unique interests, obviously all the science and carnivore stuff, but also, you're into jujitsu, you surf, you hunt. How do you think about all that? How do you balance all these activities and sort of prioritize them?
Well, I don't have a family right now. So as a single guy, I've got a little more time than those who are raising families. Maybe in the future that'll be a part of my life. But, I think that I see it as just this idea that these are all the things that make me happy, and it's not just medicine. And I probably should show more of those other parts of my personality on Instagram. Sometimes people ask me, do you just do science? And clearly I don't just do science. I'm in the gym hitting the punching bag and, rolling with people doing jujitsu, and I'm always out surfing as much as I can be, which in Washington is a little bit difficult because of lack of proximity and cold water. And then, I've just started getting back into bow hunting. And so it's great to have all these interests, and they all are kind of consistent, and they work together in some ways, but they all feed each other. I want to be outside in the wilderness. I want to be in the ocean. I need to get the sun on my skin anyway. So, and then it makes me more, I'm happy. I don't feel deprived when I'm sitting inside researching cool stuff. So it's just all the pieces of who I am. And I'll post more about that stuff in the future, probably on Instagram.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's cool because you seem so practical on the nutrition side. And not to say the things you aren't doing aren't health promoting in terms of exercise, but, you would think when you see sort of your nutritional approach, someone might think, oh man, this guy's only going to do this prescribed amount of weights and sets and resistance training and this specific cardio. But it's cool to see all your interests in terms of activities and sort of recreational exercise too. Yeah,
not at all. I'm pretty relaxed when it comes to my workouts, and I don't like it to be overly structured. I like a lot of body weight movement. And people have seen a couple of videos that I've done on Instagram. I do a lot of body weight stuff. I do some stuff with kettlebells. Whatever I feel like on that day. And a lot of days I'm just going to surf, and that's going to be my only exercise. So I'm not rigid about the exercise, and I don't actually like being in the gym. So when I'm stuck in the city, I have to go to the gym, and I'll throw around some kettlebells and hit the punching bag, but that's not what I prefer. I'd rather be out in the woods, hunting or in the ocean surfing, and, then doing some mobility stuff on the beach afterward. That's the perfect thing, in my opinion.
I love that. It's the Mark Sisson enjoyment approach.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so, Paul, I think a great place to start for people would be with just, and I know you've talked about this extensively on other shows, so we don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but the notion of plants as hormetic, as a positive stress versus a toxin, and particularly how it applies to the example you commonly give of glutathione and sulforaphane. Can you explain that for folks?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. I think that in the popular press, in the popular media, there's this idea that plants provide some sort of unique benefit to humans that we can't get in animals. And that adding plants in your diet, be it broccoli sprouts or turmeric root or something, gives humans an advantage. And I think that this is probably one of the most disruptive concepts that I and others in the field are pushing forward, that is false. And that flies in the face of $100 billion of supplements. The idea that vegetables, fruits and vegetables or supplements, molecules do not provide unique benefit to the human body in any way, shape, or form is pretty radical and is hugely disruptive. And sulforaphane is a great example. So sulforaphane is this compound that is produced when glucoraphanin in broccoli seeds or broccoli sprouts combines with myrosinase. Now, those two molecules, myrosinase is an enzyme, glucoraphanin is an isothiocyanate precursor. Those two molecules only combine when the plant is chewed or cut. And so, and we see this example in other vegetables as well. So if you look at cassava, which is frankly toxic when it's consumed without, which is a root vegetable, which is consumed without extensive processing, you see the same parallel process where there's a precursor molecule that's not toxic, an enzyme which degrades it, and then a very toxic molecule in the back end, so that the only way that those things get combined is when something chews the plant. In cassava, it's linamarin and the linamarinase, and it's an enzyme and a molecule, and they combine to form hydrocyanic acid, which is really toxic. And in broccoli sprouts, it's glucoraphanin and myrosinase combining to form sulforaphane, which I would argue is really toxic. And so the fact that this is being promoted as a supplement is wildly misunderstood and turned on its head. And though I respect Rhonda Patrick and think she's very smart, I think the work that she's doing is myopic and reductionist and doesn't take into the whole context. So let me back that up a little bit. So sulforaphane is so oxidatively reactive in the plant that it cannot exist in the plant. It would create too much oxidative damage in a broccoli plant to be present there. It's only present when the myrosinase acts on the glucoraphanin. So the reason people are told to eat broccoli sprouts is because there's so much glucoraphanin in there that you get more sulforaphane. And if you look at the only place where there's more glucoraphanin than a broccoli sprout is a broccoli seed. So broccoli seeds have even more. And again, this is the parallel that we see, that the seeds are the most highly defended part of the plant. And the next most highly defended part of the plant is a sprout. Whether it's a broccoli sprout or an alfalfa sprout, which has their own toxin. Alfalfa sprouts have cannabinine, which is frankly toxic. But sprouts are very toxic because if any part of that sprout gets consumed, the whole plant is dead. And if any part of that seed gets consumed, the whole plant, it's never going to germinate. So plants don't want animals eating those things. That's just the way it is. That's anthropomorphic, but this is true, that we see these plant defense mechanisms. So sulforaphane is sold to us, and it's probably, I have to look it up now. I think it's $100 million or more dollars a year industry. It could be even more than that. Maybe it's $1 billion now.
Wow.
Who knows? It's sold to us as a very positive thing. But I would argue that it's a very negative thing. And the first part of that argument was what I was just talking about. The idea that in the plant, it is a toxin, and that's that model, that paradigm of plant precursor, plant enzyme to toxic molecule only when the plant is chewed, and just like the cassava example. And so sulforaphane is sold to us as a benefit because in vitro studies, and even in some studies where people are given broccoli sprouts, it's shown that when you give someone broccoli sprouts, it decreases the amount of DNA damage. And so what we're doing there is looking at one metric. We're looking at DNA damage. And the way they usually measure DNA damage is with this very complex molecule called 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, or 8-OH-2DG. We'll talk about that more a little later probably, so people should know about that molecule. The other way that DNA damage is measured is with a molecule called malondialdehyde, or MDA. And so we can measure the amount of DNA damage. We can measure the amount of oxidative stress in the human body with assays like that. The other assay that's sometimes used is called TBARS, or thiobarbituric acid reactive substances. So we can measure the amount of oxidative stress. And what we find is that, when you give someone broccoli sprouts, you may see a decrease in 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine. But my argument would be that is one metric. And that is not a unique effect. We know the mechanism there. The mechanism of sulforaphane is not directly on preventing DNA damage. Sulforaphane is immediately detoxified by being conjugated to molecules like glutathione in the liver when we when we intake it and when it gets absorbed. So our body doesn't want it around. Sulforaphane doesn't circulate too long in the blood. We detoxify it quickly. It's not used in any particular unique place in human biochemistry. There's no place in the human biochemical machine where sulforaphane goes in there. Sulforaphane is not a vitamin or a mineral. No plant molecules, none of these polyphenols in plants. Sulforaphane is actually not a polyphenolic compound, but none of these molecules that are touted as antioxidants do that. None of them are vitamins or minerals. None of them serve unique roles in human biochemistry. So sulforaphane gets absorbed, we detoxify it immediately, and because it is so oxidatively reactive, it triggers what's called the Nrf2 pathway in humans. And that Nrf2 pathway is sort of the oxidative stress pathway. A lot of things can trigger it, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heterocyclic amines, which we get from overly charred meat. Now, we can go into the nuance there in a moment, but many things can trigger the Nrf2 pathway. Stress triggers it. Oxidative stress in our own bodies can trigger it, but it's a pathway that results in more glutathione being produced. Now, glutathione is this 3 amino acid antioxidant policeman in the human body. It's a very important thing. We'll talk about that later when we get into the methionine glycine balance. But glutathione is something that we want a lot of, but that is our own molecule. That is our operating system. Sulforaphane is part of a plant operating system. So sulforaphane acts to decrease DNA damage by triggering human glutathione. People will say, okay, great, that's awesome. I want to have more glutathione. The problem, or I should say the nuance there, is that you don't need sulforaphane. No one needs sulforaphane to have an adequate amount of glutathione or a healthy antioxidant system. And perhaps most importantly, because these molecules like sulforaphane or resveratrol or curcumin are from a different operating system, if we look at other areas of the body, they almost always trigger negative effects. This is the kind of stuff that Rhonda Patrick is not talking about. The only reason I single her out is because she's one of the people that really talks about this, right? She's this sulforaphane person. If you look up sulforaphane, her YouTube videos come up. So what she is not talking about are the collateral negative effects from these molecules. And we're talking about sulforaphane because it's from a separate operating system. It does things where it interferes with normal human processes in the body, specifically circulating and interfering with iodine absorption at the level of the thyroid. So you can definitely eat enough broccoli sprouts to create a hypothyroid condition, and you're eating those broccoli sprouts to do something that is to trigger glutathione, which is a mechanism that is not unique to broccoli sprouts and can be done without this molecule that has two faces, right? This is a double-edged sword. This is a molecule that does one good thing but does other bad things. I would argue that when we are eating animal foods, those animal foods don't have this two-faced quality. The animal foods are not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde like the plant foods are. They don't have these other collateral effects which are negative. And this is what people are not talking about because they want to sell supplements. Like I said, the sulforaphane industry is millions, potentially $1 billion industry. They're not going to tell you that sulforaphane is an isothiocyanate compound and will compete with the thyroid at the level of the actual thyroid gland for iodine. So you're going to affect your thyroid by taking sulforaphane. That's just one example. So this is a crazy thing. And I will just segue here for a moment to a study that I just posted about today on Instagram. And this study, the title of the study is No Effect of 600 Grams of Fruit and Vegetables Per Day on Oxidative DNA Damage and Repair in Healthy Non-Smokers. There are other studies that are basically just like this. These are fruit and vegetable deprivation studies. And what they did in this study was they set up a parallel design. They had 3 groups of people for 24 days. They had one group that ate 600 grams, so more than a pound of fruit and vegetables. One group that got a pill containing antioxidant supplements similar to 600 grams of fruits and vegetables, and one group which had no fruits and vegetables for 24 days. And then they measured things. They measured DNA damage with 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine. They measured other markers of human oxidative stress. And what they found was that after 24 days of complete depletion of fruits and vegetables, there was no difference in the level of oxidative DNA damage that was observed. So they say this suggests that the inherent antioxidant defense mechanisms of the human body are sufficient to protect circulating mononuclear blood cells from reactive oxygen species. mononuclear blood cells are some of the immune cells, that was where they were looking for the DNA damage. So this is a crazy idea that we don't need fruits and vegetables to have optimal antioxidant status.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I'm going to create a really bastardized analogy here, and tell me what you think of it. But it's kind of like we see this pathway where in muscles where tearing apart muscle fibers promotes muscle growth, and you need to tear apart muscle fibers to grow your muscle. And so we say, okay, let's take a hammer and bang it on the muscle as hard as we can. Oh, that creates more muscle damage. Therefore, hammer is good. When really the muscle damage we want is the type of muscle damage from lifting a weight, picking it up and putting it down. And that's what creates hypertrophy and grows the muscle. But we found this way to artificially, it looks like, manipulate the pathway through sulforaphane, and create a similar effect activating glutathione, but with a ton of negative consequences. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I would totally agree that we are being really myopic with this type of approach. There are many ways to achieve optimal glutathione, but we don't need sulforaphane to do it. And sulforaphane has all these negative effects that we're seeing, and it's damaging in the long term. But it's a really, really disruptive concept, and so we need to be talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And shifting topics a little bit, another thing that gets brought up is the fear of protein and either IGF-1, so insulin-like growth factor, or mTOR, and how eating a lot of protein can upregulate mTOR or IGF-1, and people are saying that's bad for longevity, that's going to promote cancerous cell growth, things like that. Why is that something that we shouldn't be afraid about on a carnivore diet?
This is a super interesting topic, and it's a little bit technical, but I think that our audience can hang with us here. So maybe we should back up for a moment and talk a little bit about mTOR and what it is.
Yeah.
So mTOR is mammalian targeted rapamycin, and it is a kinase in the cell that acts to stimulate sort of growth pathways. And at a very basic, overly simplified level, mTOR and AMP kinase are two sides of the same coin. AMP kinase being more of a catabolic pathway, mTOR being an anabolic pathway. And so we often hear, about compounds like metformin triggering AMP kinase, or fasting or ketones triggering AMP kinase. And generally the AMP kinase type pathways have been associated with longevity. But mTOR has been associated with anabolic things, that is building things up. And what we worry about, or what people are worried about, is that the anabolic pathways are, the pathways that lead to growth of the organism, but could potentially lead to cancer. But most people, I think, if they take a step back, will see that we need growth. Nobody, you can't have muscles without mTOR. You can't have stature and height. You can't develop into a normal human being without a balance between mTOR, the mammalian targeted rapamycin, and the AMP kinase pathway. So we're doing both at different times in our life. But there is this discussion now that, protein triggers mTOR. Protein is anabolic, and that is totally true. And that's a very good thing, because we need anabolic signals in our lives. We need signals that tell us to build. And people also, hate on insulin and say, oh, it's a horrible hormone. It's not a horrible hormone. It's just a hormone that's used to build, to do things. Insulin is similarly an anabolic hormone. And at certain times in our lives, pregnancy, puberty, we have tons of insulin in our bodies. We are actually insulin resistant in a normal way. Normal physiology is that we are insulin resistant because we need to build. And it's not, people, that gets into a whole nother rabbit hole that we don't have to go to right now, but insulin is not all bad. mTOR is not all bad. But the concern around a carnivorous diet, or a diet that has a lot of protein all the time, would be that we are overactivating mTOR, that mTOR is on all the time. I think most people would agree that we don't want mTOR on all the time. We don't want to constitutively express mTOR. We also don't want to constitutively express AMP kinase, because that would be like a situation, like a calorie restriction situation, which is no fun for anyone. There's basically no point in living if you're that calorie restricted. So we need both. And, if we try and imagine that we're always going to have AMP kinase only and never have any mTOR, then we're just going to be fasting all the time. We're always just going to be in caloric restriction. And we know that has negative effects on hormonal balance. And anyone that's tried a prolonged fast will know that the libido often tanks and the sleep is affected. It's good in small doses, but we need balance. This is what we get into, this concept of cyclic changes. But mTOR is this intracellular kinase molecule. So what triggers mTOR? The two big signals to mTOR are protein, specifically leucine, which is one of the branched chain amino acids, and insulin. So let's think about this from the context of a carnivorous diet. On a carnivorous diet, you and I are getting a lot of leucine. And people estimate that if you have more than 7 grams of leucine at any one time, you're probably going to trigger mTOR. And that is correct. But the triggering of mTOR with leucine versus insulin are completely different animals. And Ben Beekman has spoken about this. I'll give him a hat tip at this point for some dialogue that he and I have had and discussing some of these articles. But if people really want to get geeky, I would refer them to an article called The Actions of Exogenous Leucine on mTOR Signaling in and Amino Acid Transporters in Human Myotubes. And what was cool about this study was that they compared the activation of mTOR. They compared mTOR activation by leucine with mTOR activation with insulin, which is what we really want to look at here. And what they found was that when leucine activates mTOR, it does so a little differently than insulin. It does so in a much more transient fashion, on the order of 30 minutes to 1 hour. And then the effect is off. When you have insulin signaling, mTOR, the insulin signal is much longer, on the order of 3 to 5 hours. And so it's a much more prolonged effect, and it's a bigger effect on mTOR. So if we are comparing leucine activation of mTOR with insulin activation of mTOR, insulin is clearly the main driving factor, which isn't all bad, right? We need insulin, we need mTOR, right, but we need to know when we're doing it. But in the setting of a carnivorous diet or a ketogenic diet, insulin and leucine are completely different beasts in terms of mTOR signaling. Leucine is going to activate mTOR, but only for a short amount of time, to a lesser extent than insulin, and then it's off. And insulin is going to activate mTOR more and for a longer amount of time. So people can look at this in multiple ways. If they want to activate mTOR, you may need to actually get an insulin spike. Now, if you don't want to activate mTOR, then you don't want to have insulin around. So if we are comparing, what the irony here is that most people are demonizing high protein diets as overly activating mTOR, but the people who are doing that probably have much higher insulin than those of us who are eating keto or carnivore diets, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing for people to know is, what are my overall insulin levels? And unfortunately, there's no continuous insulin monitor, but you can do things like check your fasting insulin. And I would recommend that everyone does that. And you'll get a sense from your fasting insulin, and the overall context of your diet, what your insulin load might be. It's not that we have zero insulin, but what we know is that when you eat a lot of protein on a carnivorous diet or on a ketogenic diet, there is really no change in the insulin-glucagon ratio, and the protein isn't going to trigger insulin. So leucine does not increase insulin. So there's not a whole lot of insulin increased when you eat a bunch of protein. And there couldn't be, because if you did increase insulin, or you increase that insulin-glucagon ratio in the setting of ketosis, humans would die. Because any glucose that's in the blood, and we all have some glucose in the blood at some times, even those of us on ketogenic or carnivorous diets, any glucose in the blood is going to go into the muscle and into the liver when we spike insulin, and all the ketones are going to be shut off, because beta oxidation is going to be completely stopped when insulin spikes. That's just how it works. So then there would be no fuel for the brain and we would die. So insulin doesn't spike when you eat protein on a ketogenic or carnivorous diet the way that insulin spikes when you are eating a mixed diet and running on glycolysis. That's important for people to understand. So I think hopefully that makes sense, but I'll run through an example. So say you're eating a steak, right? I saw on your Instagram you had like some Delmonico steak and it looked amazing. Yeah. You're eating a steak. You're getting a lot of leucine in that steak along with other amino acids. That is definitely going to trigger mTOR, which is a good thing because you want mTOR, but it's only going to trigger it for 30 to 40 minutes, right? And maybe you're doing OMAD. Maybe you're doing one meal a day. That might be the only 30 to 40 minutes a day that you're triggering mTOR. Or say you eat 6 hours later during your 8 hour, 16, your 8 hour eating window, and you're doing 16/8 time restricted eating or something. Well, then you're going to trigger mTOR again, but you're triggering it twice a day for 30 to 40 minutes, and that's it. Let's contrast that with someone who's eating a moderate carbohydrate diet, maybe somebody that's eating, 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. Well, they're going to wake up in the morning, presumably they're fasted. They could also be doing time restricted eating. But they're going to wake up in the morning, they're fasted, their insulin is low, presumably. But then they eat breakfast, and if you eat carbohydrates at breakfast, and especially carbohydrates with protein, maybe they're having an orange or an apple or berries or a sweet potato or something at breakfast with some eggs, that is going to increase your insulin. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but let's think about it in terms of mTOR. That insulin is going to trigger mTOR for the next 3 to 4 hours. So then they eat lunch, and then they trigger mTOR again for 3 to 4 hours, and then they eat dinner and they trigger mTOR for 3 to 4 hours. So that person is going to have mTOR activated the whole day, and then maybe overnight they'll have a 10-hour window where mTOR is not activated. So somebody eating, they could be eating less protein than you or I on a carnivorous diet. They could be eating more carbohydrates and more fat, but their mTOR signaling is vastly different, and they're signaling mTOR for 16 hours of the 24-hour period, perhaps, or more. And even if they're doing one meal a day, then they'd only trigger it for 3 to 4 hours. If they're doing 2 meals a day, they're going to have these 2 3 to 4 hour periods where they're triggering mTOR. So we just need to, I think that the vilification of leucine, the vilification of meat as overly triggering mTOR reflects profound misunderstanding in the differential activation of this kinase by leucine and by insulin. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's more about the area under the curve.
Yes.
In terms of mTOR, both in terms of the quantity, the absolute spike, and then the time that you're under that spike.
Yes.
If you're having a lot of carbohydrate meals, it's a lot of larger and longer spikes.
Yes. The AUC is the area under the curve is what's important, because no one talks about mTOR on a mixed diet, right? People are not looking at, I don't know what example. I mean, you can look at any person. I mean, we can talk about Rhonda Patrick again, or whoever. People are not looking at Rhonda Patrick's diet, and she's eating, a variety of foods which are going to increase her insulin, and saying she's over triggering mTOR. She's going to get cancer. People are not looking at people who are moderate carbohydrate and saying you're triggering insulin, you're going to get cancer. People are looking at me and saying you're eating 2.5, 3 pounds of meat a day, you're triggering mTOR, you're going to get cancer. And it's just like, yeah, let's talk about it. You're wrong. Like I'm triggering mTOR less than you are. And not that but that, the other interesting thing there is I'm not averse to triggering mTOR from time to time, and it's okay to do it. We need it sometimes. I don't want to do it zero, but I want to try and balance it as best I can and, leverage autophagy mechanisms. And so, the corollary to this whole discussion is the idea that we can absolutely get into, states of autophagy on carnivorous diets. That's not even a question, but I think people just misunderstand the science here.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you brought up, Paul, which is super fascinating to me is glucagon insulin ratios. And Ben Bickman's work on this has been absolutely fantastic. How when you have, in the context of a low carbohydrate diet, when you have an insulin spike and glucagon goes up in the same proportion, it's not as big a deal. I know you eat, very high amounts of protein, and I've heard you talk about 3 to 3.5 pounds of meat a day. And a lot of people listening to this podcast probably also do. One thing I'm curious, I've heard insulin resistance. Everyone's heard of insulin resistance, but I've also heard Ben Bickman talk about glucagon resistance and how as we get older, perhaps we can develop glucagon resistance. Do you have any concerns about how maybe eating, 200, 300 grams of protein a day may increase our own needs for protein and amino acids over time, over a much longer time span?
I'd have to talk to Ben about that. I don't think so. I really feel like a primarily carnivorous diet is pretty evolutionarily consistent. But, perhaps people in the carnivorous community won't like the next statement, but I think that at some point in a year, most humans would probably have had some carbohydrate, whether it was from, starvation and using plants as survival food, which is what I believe they are. Or, you happen to walk by some raspberries and you're like, those look pretty good, man. I'm probably going to eat those, though, and we can talk about this as well if you want, but though I don't think fructose is a fantastic molecule for humans, I don't think any, ancestral human is going to look at raspberries and be like, no, I can't have any fructose. So yeah, I think that cyclic periods are probably the most evolutionarily consistent, and it gets into the realm of conjecture. And, I've been pretty darn strict, in my own life over the last 6 months. I mean, like, I haven't had any plants in over 6 months and I feel great. There were a few days at the beginning that I had a few tablespoons of honey. So that was sort of a different signal there where insulin goes super high and glucagon goes down, but I think that it's an interesting concept to get glucagon resistant. I don't know. I think that probably, if people wanted to experiment from time to time with introducing carbohydrates, it's not the end of the world. And I've got a feeling this summer when the berries are in season, I'll probably eat some carbohydrates from time to time. I'm not going to eat sweet potatoes, but I might eat some berries a few days, here or there. And maybe that'll be enough of a signal to trigger it or something. So, but generally, I think that's a fascinating idea. It's possible, but I'd have to really look into the mechanisms in more detail. But yeah, because the mechanisms of insulin resistance. So here's the deal. If we look at the mechanisms of insulin resistance, this is highly debated. And I think that it is very far from clear, though Ben might correct me on this. I don't think it's clear that elevated insulin is the reason we get insulin resistant per se. People might be freaking out when they hear that. Of course, that's why we get insulin resistant. I think it's more complicated than that. And, this is the work of Stephen Guyenet. And I mean, Ben has talked about this too. There are other things that go into insulin resistance other than persistently high insulin, right? You can look at plenty of populations who have high carbohydrate in their diet, like the Tavaruans or the Catawans, who don't look insulin resistant at all. And I think that the other part of this equation are things like inflammation, oxidized omega-6 fatty acids that are probably playing into this insulin resistant phenotype. I think that insulin resistance itself has to do with perhaps an elevated insulin level in the setting of underlying inflammation. I think that's more, it's a multi-hit hypothesis here. So that makes me also less concerned about glucagon resistance in the absence of underlying inflammation. But I think that to suggest that insulin resistance is purely due to sort of constitutively high insulin is an oversimplification. That doesn't seem to happen, and I'm sure you've seen examples of this. Like, not everyone who eats rice all the time gets insulin resistant. Some people do, but then it gets into this nuance, like, are there other inflammatory factors going on there? And I would argue there probably are. And other issues, is there micronutrient deficiency? Are we looking at, I think that it's a more complex equation than just eating too many carbohydrates makes you insulin resistant. That might be an oversimplification of Gary Taubes. I think that we know that fructose can make you insulin resistant, but again, that's through different mechanisms. Those are molecular mechanisms rather than excess carbohydrate. And I think that these underlying molecular mechanisms of insulin resistance need to be considered in addition to persistently elevated levels of insulin. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I even had a little very brief, not elegant and long form back and forth with Dr. Bickman on Twitter and just said, is this something you've seen or would be concerned about? And he said, not that I know of. But I've just heard about people talking about amino acid resistance over building as you get older, requiring more protein. And I was wondering, is it a function of something else, to your point, as a factor of getting older, inflammation, something else, or is it a factor of the times that we've eaten protein? And it seems like it's probably the former, but just an interesting hypothesis.
Oh, it's a super interesting idea because it gets to this idea, what causes insulin resistance, which I would argue is one of the most pertinent questions of our generation.
Absolutely.
Because we know that insulin resistance underlies many, many diseases, from Alzheimer's to, Parkinson's, or is connected with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, atherosclerosis, progression of lipids. Like, it's so important to understand. And even just defining insulin resistance is a little bit tricky, but it seems I believe strongly there is an inflammatory component to insulin resistance. And understanding where that inflammatory component is coming from is not always clear, but I think things like oxidized omega-6, 4-HNE, these acrolein derivatives of oxidized omega-6 are a really good possibility for contributing to that. Tucker Goodrich has talked a lot about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Seed oils.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been a strong proponent of kind of nose to tail carnivore and not just pure muscle meat carnivore. Can you talk a little bit about why, and we can take it down many different trails from there?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm great friends with Sean Baker, but he and I kind of differ on this. And my perspective is that, from an evolutionary perspective, all of the indigenous cultures that I've ever studied eat nose to tail. They don't waste any part of the animal. And I mean, really like any part of the animal. They eat the skin, they eat the hide. They're not going to eat the hair on the hide, but they eat the skin, they eat the brain, they eat the eyeballs. You know, I mean, it gets gross to our westernized sensitivities, but they eat the bones when they can. You know, they'll eat the soft ends of the bones, they'll eat the marrow. They definitely eat the tendons. They make tendon soup. And so they eat all of the organs. And so just at a basic evolutionary anthropologic level, I think this is a very consistent thing to be doing. What's interesting is that when we go further and we look at human nutritional biochemistry, there is a lot of parallel and consistency here. What we see is that in the various compartments of an animal are unique nutrients. This is incredibly fascinating. If we just eat muscle meat, we'll get a lot of really great things, but we won't get all of the nutrients a human needs to function. And Sean would probably debate me on this. But if we just look in terms of what we know in human biochemistry, there are things in muscle meat that are great. There's plenty of B6. There's lots of heme iron. There's a full complement of amino acids. But there are a number of things which are not present in high amounts in muscle meat. And we can go into some of those.
Yeah.
So let's just start with organ meats. And then we can talk about connective tissue and get into the methionine glycine thing. But if we look at muscle meat, what is muscle meat missing that humans need? The first thing might be vitamin A. And there is this whole alternative hypothesis about vitamin A being toxic, which I looked into that and deeply, and I am pretty darn convinced that vitamin A is not toxic for humans. So if people are aware of this alternative hypothesis from Grant Genero and other folks that vitamin A is toxic, I would say no. There is no medical evidence that vitamin A is toxic at this point, and there's never been a documented case of vitamin A toxicity related to liver consumption. There have been documented cases of vitamin A toxicity related to supplement consumption. So in my own personal practice, I never supplement vitamin A for people because I am concerned that the form of vitamin A that's in supplements, which they will call as a retinol derivative, can oxidize to retinoic acid or dangerous other forms of vitamin A. We don't want retinoic acid in our diets. That's toxic. But the retinol form of vitamin A that's in liver, I think, is totally safe for humans. And, one of the things I should look into is whether there's ever been a documented case of a birth defect related to excess liver consumption. We do know that women in pregnancy should not overconsume vitamin A supplements. But again, I really think that this is one of the differences between a supplemental form of a vitamin and an animal-based whole food form. Doesn't sound like a scientific thing to say, but if we look at it, these can be in different forms and our body deals with them differently. We know that with like folic acid and folate, methylfolate, folinic acid, we can talk about all that stuff. But I would argue that if women are pregnant, sure, don't overconsume vitamin A in liver until we really have figured this out. But for everyone else, there's never been a documented case of vitamin A toxicity from eating liver. And so I think it's totally safe to eat basically as much liver as you feel like you would like to eat. There's all this concern that people died eating polar bear livers, and there's a lot of actual data to suggest that may have been due to cadmium toxicity in the polar bear livers rather than the vitamin A. Who knows? I don't think anybody listening to this is eating polar bear liver. If you're eating beef liver, if you're eating chicken liver, I would eat it without any concern that vitamin A is going to accumulate or cause any problems. I would argue that muscle meat doesn't have much vitamin A. You will become vitamin A deficient if you do not eat liver or egg yolks in your diet. And so this gets into the nose to tail idea. Like, this is just one thing. So that's the vitamin A thing. And we don't want to become vitamin A deficient. Now, vitamin A is a fat soluble vitamin, so it's going to take a lot of time to become vitamin A deficient, but I fear that it will happen for people if they are just eating muscle meat. What else is muscle meat lacking that we see in liver? Well, the other thing is copper. If you just eat muscle meat, there's not a lot of copper in muscle meat, and copper is one of these minerals that we need. We should not be supplementing with copper unless we're working with a physician, because excess copper can be dangerous. But our body has this really elegant system by which it balances zinc and copper in a diet and in our bodies. Zinc and copper are stored together with a metallothionein protein in the cells that line the intestines. And so when our body wants to get rid of copper, it has to get rid of zinc. But our body uses those cells in the intestine to get rid of excess copper. We can give ourselves a copper deficiency by over-consuming zinc without enough copper. So eating muscle meat, which is high in zinc, without any copper source, is going to give us a zinc excess, which is not toxic in and of itself, unless we consider the fact that that zinc excess will lead to a copper deficiency. And a copper deficiency is clinically important. It looks like B12 deficiency. It has posterior column neurologic signs. It's a fairly severe thing. A copper deficiency is a big deal. Now, this may take time. It will depend on your copper stores, but there are also hundreds of enzymes in the body that are copper deficient, that are copper dependent. And so before we get to that degree of copper deficiency, we're going to inhibit the activities of many enzymes in the body that are copper deficient. One of those is the superoxide dismutase enzyme, which is involved in antioxidant defense. It's a copper dependent enzyme, and there are many of these enzymes. So we need to be very careful of our copper status. But where is the sort of beautiful symmetry here that if we are eating liver, in addition to muscle meat, you're going to get vitamin A, and you're also going to get copper to balance the high zinc in the muscle meat. Other good sources of copper are things like oysters, but oysters are also really high in zinc, so it's hard to know what the copper level is. Ultimately, a lot of this boils down to working with a qualified functional medicine doc or somebody that's going to get into all this nutritional stuff with you. If you're doing something out of the norm or not eating nose to tail, I even recommend people eating nose to tail working with a doc like that, and to get a sense of like where things are. There may be imbalances leading up to all this that could be exacerbated by the diet. So far we've talked about vitamin A, we've talked about copper. Let's talk about folate and some of the B vitamins. So if we look at muscle meat is pretty high in some of the B vitamins, but not all the B vitamins. Muscle meat really doesn't have a whole lot of biotin or folate. Now, folate is not folic acid. Folic acid is a synthetic molecule that we have created in westernized society because it's cheaper and shelf stable. And a lot of people are concerned that folic acid may actually bind to and block folate receptors. So I don't recommend any folic acid supplementation to my clients or anyone listening. But we do need folate. And folate is usually in the form of dihydrofolate or L-methylfolate in foods. Now, there's not a whole lot of that in muscle meat. There's a little bit in egg yolks, and there's a little bit more in liver. So if we are eating egg yolks and liver, then we are going to be getting more folate and enough folate to meet our requirements. But if we're not eating those foods, and egg yolks alone are probably not enough to give us our folate requirements, we may become deficient, and we need to check this because a folate deficiency is a big deal. Folate can cause megaloblastic anemia, which is similar to B12 deficiency. They're completely different syndromes, but folate deficiency can cause issues with DNA repair and DNA creation and can inhibit the folate cycle, which leads to the formation of SAMe. When you inhibit the folate cycle, you're not going to make enough SAMe, acetylmethionine, which is a methyl donor, and you're not going to be able to use those methyl groups. And again, over 300 actions in the body. So we don't want to become folate deficient.
Right. And I actually, we mentioned this before we started recording, Paul, but I developed a folate deficiency. I've been on a carnivore diet for about 2.5 years, and about a year and a half in, my blood levels of folate, and we can make arguments about whether the levels in the normal range applies to carnivores as it does to others. But my levels were very low on folate about a year and a half into a carnivore diet. And I'm going to do a full podcast on my blood work and how it's evolved over time on carnivore. But, I took a shotgun approach, and, it would have been more scientific to just add back in liver, but I added, a folate supplement. I added, liver once a week, and my folate is back now in the normal range.
That's great. You were checking a serum folate?
Yep.
I would recommend people check an RBC folate. So,
okay.
An RBC folate is much better to check than a serum folate. Checking the levels of many of these things is difficult, but there are other things you could check to look at your folate levels: homocysteine, methionine levels, which is why working with somebody who's a functional medicine doc, I see clients for this kind of stuff, is really important. But yeah, you need to check your homocysteine levels, potentially MMA, to make sure that B12 is not also deficient, because if you're deficient in folate, you need to make sure that you don't also have B12. Usually on a carnivorous diet, you're not going to become deficient in B12 unless you have pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune condition in the stomach. But the folate in the serum folate is not a great reflection overall of folate status. You want to check RBC folate and probably homocysteine as well. But the fact that it was low was probably not a good indicator. And what type of a folate supplement did you end up taking?
I would have to check. I think it was the Solgar brand. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was methylated, I believe.
Just make sure it's not folic acid.
Yeah, it wasn't folic acid.
And the other thing I would say to people around folate is that you can oversupplement with methylfolate. So getting excess amounts of methylfolate is not a good idea either. I am a proponent of really trying to dial this stuff in with your food alone, because I think it gives our body a little more of an ability to kind of regulate things. And then when we were talking about folate, we're also talking about riboflavin. There's a decent amount of riboflavin in muscle meat, but there's even more in liver. And so if people, this is just where it gets into, like, if people are empowered and they want to really optimize their health, they need to also know their riboflavin status. And I would argue that for a lot of people, if they're just eating muscle meat, you might become riboflavin deficient. And then we also talked about biotin, which is present in egg yolks, but not present in high amounts in muscle meat. And so the list really goes on, but liver itself is a very valuable tool and provides, or it's a food, but it's a valuable addition to the diet. And it really, complements muscle meat. And I think that most people would be remiss if they did not include liver in their diets. Now, then the question becomes, well, how much liver? I really think humans will benefit from at least 8 ounces to 16 ounces plus of liver per week. Right now I'm eating probably 2 to 3 ounces of liver per day. I would say closer to 3 ounces of liver per day. If you look at that 3 ounce amount of liver, you're getting quite a bit of a lot of things that are beneficial. You're getting a decent amount of vitamin C. There's been all the discussion about vitamin C on carnivorous diets, but if people are worried about vitamin C, you're getting upwards of 30 milligrams from 3 ounces of liver. And you're also getting riboflavin in very robust amounts in 3 ounces of liver. You're getting quite a bit of vitamin A. You're getting a very decent dose of copper. That 2 to 3 ounce dose of liver per day seems to provide people with a lot of goodness. A lot of people are taking these desiccated liver capsules, which are great if you absolutely cannot handle the taste of liver, but the dosing is so small that for the clients that I have that take the liver caps, I usually recommend 12 at least a day, and probably 24 would be the optimal dose. So I probably should just start selling my liver jerky.
And Paul, I know you make the liver jerky, and folks can check out your Instagram if they want a little bit more on how to make that. I've heard that cooking, and especially dehydrating meat and organs, can remove some of the vitamins and minerals. Are you at all concerned about that when it comes to liver?
It depends how you dehydrate it. I had recommended to someone to make liver jerky, and they said, okay, I did 250 degrees for 3 hours in the oven. I said, whoa, no, not that. I do mine at 135 degrees. when I dehydrate. So it's 135 degrees for about a day. And,
Okay.
you know, I haven't actually done formal laboratory analysis of that. I do think raw liver is probably the best thing, and I've started doing some of that in my diet as well. I will caution people around raw foods because of, you know, bacteria or parasites in like raw liver, but it's pretty rare and it's safe if you freeze the liver for a few weeks before you eat it raw. So there are liver parasites that animals do have. So eating raw liver right out of a fresh animal may or may not be the best thing to do for a human. It's not going to kill you. You could get rid of it if you got one. But if people want to eat raw liver, I would say try and freeze the liver for a few weeks before. That usually kills the parasites. As an aside, much of the sushi, the salmon sushi, the sashimi that's sold in restaurants, must be frozen. It is illegal to sell fresh salmon sashimi because there is a tapeworm in that salmon called Diphyllobothrum latum that causes all sorts of problems. So eating fresh raw salmon is not a good idea. So just saying, you know, there's not a lot of tapeworms in raw meat.
Right.
But there are obviously tapeworms in things like pigs, and you know, there's other issues with those kind of animals, bears. You know, depending what kind of animal people are hunting and killing, you don't always want to eat the meat raw. Sometimes you do need to process it for safety. But if people want to eat raw liver, I think that's great. Just freeze the liver for a few weeks, and it should get rid of anything that was even there. Though I'm not terribly concerned. And as you know, I eat a lot of raw egg yolks. The reason I don't worry about raw egg yolks is because any Campylobacter or Salmonella is on the shell, and I'm cracking the egg and the shell is not actually touching the yolk at all. I've eaten literally probably close to 10,000 raw egg yolks in my life, and I've never gotten sick from it that I'm aware of. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Me too. I love raw egg yolks. The perfect sauce.
It is
absolutely delicious.
Oh my God. It's so good. And it's quick. It's easy. You know, you get up in the morning and you have 3 minutes to eat breakfast. You can just do 4 or 5 raw egg yolks and a little bit of liver jerky and a spoonful of salmon roe, and there's your breakfast. You didn't even have to cook steak, you know.
Got your nutrients covered for the day.
Well, pretty good. You know, obviously muscle meat has some unique benefits, and you're not getting a whole lot of protein in any of that, but you just got a lot of minerals and micronutrients in that. So, and then,
Absolutely.
you know, yeah, we can also talk about the methionine glycine ratio.
Yeah, let's do it.
Moving on in the sort of discussion about nose to tails. So, you know, the first thing we were talking about there was the idea that it's important to eat organ meats with your muscle meats. And the biggest organ meat, or the most important organ meat, I would argue, is liver. Heart is uniquely beneficial as well, but I don't think heart has anything in it specifically that you cannot find in the muscles. Heart has a little more coenzyme Q10, but I assure you, I've never seen a carnivore who's deficient in coenzyme Q10 or needs a coenzyme Q10 supplement. The highest levels I've ever seen of coenzyme Q10 in the body are in carnivorous humans. So, and heart has a little more riboflavin than muscle meat, but heart is great, but I don't think it's unique. And, you know, kidneys they're kind of like liver in terms of their nutrients. Kidneys, I would say, are like mini liver. They may have some unique things. I heard on a podcast that perhaps kidneys have the enzyme diamine oxidase, which may help some people with histamine intolerance. But I think if you're only going to eat one organ, it would be liver. Obviously, I think eating the whole animal would be great, but it's hard for us all to eat kidney and pancreas and spleen all the time. That may be an application for some of these desiccated organ complexes. The next category of nose to tail eating that I would recommend people think of is connective tissue. And this is where the recommendations I have to eat collagen and or bone broth and or tendons and or glycine supplementation come in. And this gets into what we can call the methionine glycine ratio. There's been some discussion online about this recently that people may have heard. It's a little complicated, but I'll try and break it down for people. So methionine and glycine are 2 amino acids in the human body and in meat. And if we look at studies in rats, we know that feeding rats a high methionine diet has been shown to accelerate the aging process. And it's a little difficult to equate percentages of methionine in rat diets to percentages of methionine in human diets, but the concept is that methionine excess in rats and other animals is a bad thing. And I should say methionine excess in relation to glycine. So there's a lot of research on this. This is a paper, the title is Methionine Toxicity in the Rat in Relation to Hepatic Accumulation of S-Adenosyl Methionine, which is SAMe, prevention by dietary stimulation of the hepatic transsulfuration pathway, which they did via glycine. So this gets into complex biochemistry, but the idea is that they fed these rats toxic levels of methionine with or without simultaneous dietary supplements of glycine and serine. And so this is kind of the model that I just want people to be aware of, that in rats and in humans, it is possible to achieve toxic levels of methionine. The concern becomes, does a diet of exclusively muscle meat create a potentially damaging or excess methionine state? And we don't know. But as Sean Baker has pointed out, there, in the absence of glucose, that more of the glycine in muscle meat is absorbed. And as you pointed out with the study that you sent me before we got on, there is a decent amount of glycine in muscle meat. If we look at the percentages of glycine and methionine in muscle meat, I believe methionine is on the order of 2% in muscle meat, and glycine is on the order of 7 to 8% in muscle meat. So there's more glycine than methionine in muscle meat. But if we look at the relative amounts of methionine and glycine in collagen or connective tissue, they're even more in favor of glycine, almost double. So methionine in collagen is about 0.9%, and glycine is over 20% in collagen, which makes sense because the actual collagen molecule is 3 amino acids composed of glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. So we would expect that there's going to be quite a bit of glycine in collagen, which is why I recommend collagen supplementation. So when I recommend collagen supplementation to people, I am essentially recommending glycine supplementation, because in my opinion, the downside to supplementing with glycine is very little, and the downside to having methionine excess is very large. Because of this excess S-adenosyl methionine and excess sort of oxidative stress that comes with methionine excess. There are many studies in rodents that suggests that this can be a real problem. There's another study, the effect of dietary glycine on methionine metabolism in rats fed a high methionine diet. Now, just in the summary, they says the alleviation mechanism of methionine toxicity by dietary glycine was investigated in rats, in weanling rats fed a high methionine diet. So what do we see here? Hopefully this is making sense to people and I'm not just rambling, but in rats and in humans, the biochemistry is the same. We can relieve any excess methionine syndrome stress by supplementing glycine. And the question becomes, is there enough glycine in muscle meat to balance the methionine in muscle meat? And I would say, I can't say. It's probably an individual thing, but the supplementation with glycine containing molecules like collagen or straight glycine is pretty darn safe and effective. We can definitely assess this in people. So if someone is only eating meat and doesn't want to supplement glycine, then you can easily check this by checking a few markers in the blood. You could look for a molecule called pyroglutamate, which is one of the breakdown products of glutathione. When there is inadequate glycine to make glutathione, which is a very important antioxidant molecule that we talked about, you will get an accumulation of pyroglutamic acid or pyroglutamate. So with a urinary organic acids test, you can check the level of pyroglutamate. So exclusively meat-eating carnivores would do well to check pyroglutamic acid levels in the urine. Also, it would be important to check glutathione levels, because one of the issues with methionine toxicity is that it can actually create a glycine deficiency. The buffering of methionine in the human body uses up glycine. So methionine is converted to homocysteine, and in that process, glycine is converted to dimethylglycine, which is then excreted or used in other processes. So by eating a lot of methionine, we will use up our glycine, but our body needs the glycine to make collagen and glutathione. Those are both 3 amino acid peptides that are crucially dependent on glycine. Now, again, this is getting kind of complicated, but hopefully people are hanging in there. The human body can make glycine. It is considered to be a conditionally essential amino acid, not an essential amino acid. However, in other studies that have been done, in the elderly, admittedly, glycine deficiency has found to be a big problem, and it looks like we cannot actually make enough glycine, even in all humans, but in humans sort of fed mixed diets. I was sort of mixing up the two studies there. In humans fed mixed diets, there's evidence that there is a glycine deficiency and that most humans generally run on a glycine deficit, which would make the glycine more of less of a conditionally essential amino acid and more of a essential amino acid. So this paper is entitled "A Weak Link in Metabolism: The Metabolic Capacity for Glycine Biosynthesis Does Not Satisfy the Need for Collagen Synthesis." So they estimate that the total amount of glycine available from synthesis, 3 grams per day, together with that available from the diet in the range of 1.5 to 3 grams a day, may fall significantly short of all of the needed amount for all metabolic uses, including collagen synthesis, by about 10 grams per day for a 70 kilogram human. Now, this is assuming that people are getting 1.5 to 3 grams of glycine per day. We could put that in the context of a carnivorous diet, which would have more glycine. Even if you were eating muscle meat, a carnivorous would have more glycine. But if the methionine is biochemically being buffered by the glycine, then the equation gets to be a little more complicated. So hopefully what people are seeing here is this is far from clear. The downsides to having a glycine deficit are large, meaning not enough collagen synthesis and not enough glutathione synthesis. And the downsides to having excess glycine or excess collagen in the diet are very few, but I will address those. Is that making sense so far?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Paul, just to put a kind of finer point on it, if your body can't make collagen, if you have a glycine deficiency, what are some of the bad things that could eventually happen down the road?
Well, I mean, collagen is used in all of our connective tissues. So muscles, tendons, ligaments, bone, skin, hair, nails, teeth. Collagen is sort of touted as this supplement for hair, skin, and nails. So we could see things like accelerated aging, wrinkles, connective tissue insufficiency, tendon, ligament rupture, ruptured discs in the back, nothing good.
Yeah, you become weak and frail and die.
Nothing good comes from a collagen deficiency. And I often wonder when I see people my age or younger having problems with their back, herniated discs, I wonder, is that a collagen deficiency? Like, I think it's totally possible. Like, standard westernized humans are clearly running in a glycine deficiency. Eating a carnivorous diet is a great way to get a lot of glycine. However, I am concerned that you're also getting a lot of methionine in the muscle meat. And I just want people to ensure that they are getting adequate glycine to balance that and either supplement with collagen, supplement with bone broth, which is a source of collagen. You can supplement with glycine specifically if people have histamine intolerance or histamine sensitivity. You can use just the glycine amino acid supplement. A lot of people don't want to do that. That's fine. Or you can eat tendon, which is my goal, is just to eat tendon and just eat nose to tail. When I eat New York steaks, those are probably my favorite steaks now. That's probably sacrilegious to say that a ribeye isn't my favorite. I like the New York steak because the New York steak has a really thick tendon on the backside. And I think, this is maybe a little more collagen that I'm getting from this tendon. I like this idea because it's been hard for me to source tendons. I'm working with some butchers to source actual tendon. And if people have been to like Vietnamese restaurant and had pho, the soup, you can get tendon in your soup and it's actually quite delicious. And in Asian cultures, tendons are eaten. I think our ancestors, once they figured out that if you boil the tendon for a certain amount of time, it gets to be really delicious and soft and tender, they would have eaten the heck out of those things and never wasted them at all. Yeah. So, and then we know that indigenous cultures also eat the skin of the animal, which is very high in connective tissue, which is very high in collagen. So there's evolutionary precedent. It makes sense to do it. And I worry that biochemically, the muscle meat may be a little bit too high in methionine, may use up the glycine that's coming with it. We may run a glycine deficit, and that runs into problems with collagen and glutathione synthesis, and not a lot of downsides.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. Finish your thought.
The only downside I've seen to collagen supplementation for some people are twofold. Some people do seem to be sensitive to histamine, which is a whole separate issue that would be well treated working with a functional medicine doc. And the hydrolysis process of collagen may create some histamine. And people who drink bone broth, there's sometimes histaminergic substances in bone broth. Some people with histamine sensitivity cannot do bone broth or collagen. In those cases, I would recommend just glycine supplementation, and you might only need to supplement with 10 grams of glycine powder per day. The nice thing about glycine powder is it's sweet and it tastes like sugar. So that's kind of magical. You can like put it in tea. If people drink tea, I don't actually think tea is something to be included on a carnivorous diet, but you could put it in hot water. You can put it over something that you want to be sweet. I don't know what people on carnivorous diets want to be sweet, but anyway, you could use glycine powder as a supplement for sugar in some things that you were doing because it's sweet like sugar. People wouldn't know the difference. And so the other thing that's been talked about with collagen is that in some of the breakdown pathways of hydroxyproline are the formation of oxalates. And this is true, but the hydroxyproline getting broken down to oxalates, that pathway tends to happen more when there's a B6 deficiency. So if we ensure adequate B6 status, it's unlikely that people will have any breakdown or any significant breakdown of the hydroxyproline in collagen to oxalates. If they were concerned, they could just check their urinary oxalate levels. But for people with a history of calcium oxalate kidney stones, those people should not be eating things like spinach and almonds and rhubarb and the vegetables, which are high in oxalates, but they may also not want to overdo it on collagen unless knowing that their B6 status is totally adequate, which it should be on a carnivorous diet because there's tons of B6 in meat, but you could also check your B6 status, which is pyridoxine, in a variety of ways, or you can check your urinary oxalate excretion. But otherwise, there are very few downsides to supplementing with collagen, bone broth, tendons, etc. It seems to be a very safe way to ensure that our body is metabolically ideal or as ideal as possible.
Yeah, you've inspired me to try it out, Paul, and I've been putting beef gelatin, Great Lakes brand, on my steaks. And I know you recommend about 10 grams of glycine a day. How much of the beef gelatin would you recommend? I've heard you say something like 10 grams per 100 grams of protein from muscle meat. Is that 10 grams worth of glycine or 10 grams worth of collagen or 10 grams worth of protein? I just wanted to make sure I understood the dose.
It's 10 grams of collagen. So if you look at the amino acid composition of collagen, I'm holding the Great Lakes bottle in my hand. Per 12 grams of collagen, you are getting 2.8 grams of glycine. So if we are aiming for that approximately 10 grams of glycine per day, then you might need a little more than 3 12-gram servings of collagen to get there.
Got it. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm thinking about just with all these deficiencies, whether it's fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, copper, glycine, is there an aspect of catching up? So if someone has been, on a standard American diet, on a keto diet, on a muscle meat-based carnivore diet for a while, should they be kind of overdoing it? Maybe you're talking about three servings worth of gelatin a day. Maybe someone like me or another carnivore who hasn't been supplementing with gelatin in the past, is there potentially an argument for saying maybe we should double that or 1.5 times that for a certain period of time?
It's possible. Yeah. That's one of the things that I run into with my clients when I start working with them is what are your pre-carnivore levels? people come in and they're deficient in vitamin A already, or they already have really low glycine, or they have really low zinc, or they already have really low copper. And so that's why it's helpful to work with somebody. But yeah, if there are deficiency levels then that are pre-existing, that can complicate the equation. In most people, they'll probably normalize long term, but in the short term, perhaps they could feel a little better, a little faster.
Yeah. And another thing you've talked about is bone meal. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that and also tying it in with boron. And one thing I had asked you just over social media was whether there's sufficient boron in bone meal so that you don't have to separately supplement with boron. But I couldn't find anywhere, at least online, talking about boron, something that quantifies the amount of boron in bone meal.
I'll have to try and send that to you. I know I found it at one point. So bone meal is interesting. So this is the other, as we go further down the nose to tail rabbit hole, one of the things that we see indigenous cultures eating are bones, whether it's flaked bone or soft ends of bones or small bones in fish or small bones in other animals like small monkeys, but they do eat bones. And this is, at a basic level, this is a calcium source. Others online, I know Frank Tufano did a video on YouTube, and I appreciate Frank's work, but he said, we don't need calcium, it's not good for us. And I said, actually, that's wrong. Like, humans need calcium. We just have a whole lot of stores of it in our bones. But calcium is a very tightly regulated mineral in the blood. And if you don't eat calcium, the blood levels of calcium won't change until you are profoundly deficient, because if the calcium levels change in the blood, that's a really big deal. So again, this kind of goes back to the parallel with the folate issue. Serum calcium is not a good indicator of your calcium homeostasis. You'd have to look at ionized calcium and PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, your vitamin D levels. So getting an idea of your calcium status is much more complicated than just a serum calcium level, which is tightly regulated. So I would argue that humans do need calcium. That's a beneficial thing. The wrinkles around calcium come in the form of studies that have been done that suggest that calcium supplementation led to increased levels of cardiovascular events and calcified plaque in women in the past. And I would argue that this is probably an indication of profound vitamin K2 deficiency in most of the population. That when we supplement calcium in people who are vitamin K2 deficient, we maybe get increased atherosclerosis. But in the setting of adequate vitamin K2 stores, and this goes back to the idea of fat-soluble vitamins, nose to tail eating, in the context of adequate vitamin K2, which has many forms, I do not believe that calcium supplementation in the form of bones or bone meal is going to contribute in any way to calcification of plaque or atherosclerotic processes. This is the sort of responsibility of people to make sure they have enough vitamin K2. You can check vitamin K2 levels, not directly usually. It usually has to do with a surrogate marker for vitamin K2, but that can be done fairly easily. Carnivorous diets are usually pretty high in vitamin K2. Liver is a great source. Muscle meat has a decent amount of K2 as well as egg yolks. So as long as we are getting adequate fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin K2, vitamin A, I believe that our body will manage the minerals in a much better way, specifically the calcium. So I think people would do well to eat calcium from bones. And I supplement with bone meal. Concerns around bone meal also extend to heavy metal contamination. I tried hard to source a bone meal that was Prop 65 compliant. It's from the grass-fed cows in New Zealand. If people message me, I'm happy to tell them which one I use. It's on my Instagram. It's pretty straightforward. But or I can just tell them now it's whole bone calcium from Traditional Foods Market. I don't have
There's also Now Foods I found on Amazon. I don't have a way of checking if it's Prop 65 or not, but it's also from, I believe, grass-finished cattle.
Yeah. And then I know KAL makes one, but I don't know that one is from grass-finished cattle. So I don't have any affiliation with any of those companies. although they probably should give me a kickback with how many people are going to buy it. So the other things that we see in nose-to-tail eating are interesting here. Manganese is present in bones and liver, but not present much in muscle meat. And so we're getting good manganese in bones. And then the other one, which was interesting to me, was boron. Boron has been studied around male and female hormones, specifically testosterone and estrogen. I posted about this on my Instagram, but if we look at a carnivorous diet, it is actually a boron deficient diet unless we are eating bone meal, because boron is not stored anywhere in the body other than bones. And I can try and find you after the podcast my reference. I at some point found something that suggested that there were, I think, 2 grams about, or I have to look at the dosing, 2 milligrams of boron in, like, I want to say like a teaspoon of bone meal, but don't quote me on that. I'll have to find it for you. So there is definitely a moderate amount of, maybe there's even more boron. There's a decent amount of boron in the bone meal. And I think there is no need to supplement boron if we are eating bone meal. But my concern was we would maybe get boron deficient if we were not eating bones. And that kind of makes sense just from an evolutionary perspective. You know, we're going to eat some bones in the wild, and we should eat some bones. And then I did an experiment, people can see on Instagram. When we cycle boron, you will see I supplemented for some amount of time. I was doing boron glycinate from Pure Encapsulations, again, no affiliation. And I did 10 milligrams every day for about 2 weeks. And then I rechecked my testosterone, and the free testosterone was maybe 35 to 40% higher. And the sex hormone binding globulin had gone down. I think my free testosterone, the units are always funny on this. My free testosterone went from about 560 to over 800. And the sex hormone binding globulin went from, I think, 55 to 47 or something. So the total went up, the free went up, and the sex hormone binding globulin went down. So it does appear that cycling boron glycinate at doses of 10 milligrams a day, we can affect free testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin in what appears to be a positive way. And then there's also studies in women that suggest that boron is important as well, which would make sense. And women are not going to get masculinized by doing this. It regulates their hormones in a similar way. I think it seems to result in improvements in estrogen and testosterone levels in women in similar ways. What we see long-term with boron at supplementation of 10 milligram doses is that generally that kind of normalizes and goes back to the pre-testing levels. So if people really want to keep doing that, they need to cycle the boron, and I'm not sure that that's the best thing either, but it seems to work in the short term. There are questions which remain around the benefits of boron with long-term supplementation, but I do worry that a boron deficient diet could be created if you just eat a carnivorous diet without bones. And, you know, bones are the only source of calcium unless you want to eat eggshells, but so that's the bone piece.
Yeah, very interesting and helpful, Paul. And that kind of gets to the point you're talking about calcium of electrolytes, you know, sodium, potassium, magnesium. I know you've said you add salt to your steaks. Do you also proactively supplement with potassium or magnesium at all?
I have not done it excessively. I have experimented with it. And this is an interesting piece that I am still researching and talking to others in the community about. It seems to be very individual. Some of the people I work with on carnivorous diets have totally adequate red blood cell stores of magnesium and potassium. Other people tend to have more cramping or seem to have issues with this. So I have experimented with magnesium and potassium supplementation at times. I don't do it excessively, but I have thought about it, and I haven't quite figured out what the ideal thing is now. There is some thinking that perhaps boron deficiency may contribute to inadequate magnesium, and that inadequate magnesium can contribute to inadequate potassium. I think that's a little bit of a theoretical thing, but the electrolytes may all be connected. But I think the electrolyte question is very interesting. We just need, if we're doing it, I think it's pretty safe to supplement with magnesium and or potassium. We just need to realize what forms we are using and the potential side effects. Magnesium is a cathartic, and if we're using the wrong types of magnesium, that will cause loose bowels, which is no fun for anyone. And too much potassium can certainly cause a problem. If people are doing potassium chloride supplementation, I would be quite careful about that, and presumably do it, or preferentially do it in this setting of working with a physician and knowing your baseline potassium levels, because supplementing oral potassium is not something to mess around with. It's pretty darn safe, but you could absolutely give yourself too much oral potassium.
Yeah, that's a great word of caution. And do you limit or regulate the amount of salt you put on your food, or just mostly salt to taste?
I salt to taste. I don't oversalt. No, I salt to taste. And I would estimate, I use Redmond Real Salt. I like the inland deposit for absence of microplastics, things like this. And I don't know how much I use in a day. It's not a small amount. I would estimate it's more than 3 to 4 grams of salt a day, but I don't think it's 10 grams a day.
And I've heard you talk about, your major downsides or concerns about dairy consumption, especially, the hyper-processed, bastardized dairy we eat today. I'm curious about your thoughts on whey protein, and kind of circling back to our discussion on folks who want to promote mTOR. If someone wanted to boost mTOR or potentially insulin in an effort to build muscle on a carnivore diet, which, to your point, if the insulin spikes are smaller and the mTOR spikes are shorter, it's hard to do that. What do you think about adding whey protein, and where would your concerns be there?
So dairy and whey protein are pretty interesting things to consider. I'm generally not a fan. I don't see a ton of applications for this in the diet, and I'll tell you why. What I have seen with people in dairy is that probably because of the casomorphine in dairy, there appears to be some alteration of the satiety points. When people cut out dairy, they're often much more sensitive to when they're full and are able to lose a few pounds of weight without even trying. So I have a concern about that aspect. Then there are also casein and whey, which are quite immunogenic for many people. So I'm not a fan of dairy because of the casomorphin, the interference, and the satiety mechanisms, and the potentially immunogenic compounds in the dairy. If people want to trigger mTOR, I would do it with insulin rather than whey protein. And I'm not aware of actually any studies, perhaps you can show them, that would suggest that the whey protein is going to uniquely trigger mTOR. I think that if people want to trigger mTOR, that they should do it with insulin, and you could do it with honey. If people want to do it with carbohydrates, that's fine. You can do it with white rice. That's fairly benign in terms of anti-nutrients, which gets you kind of close to like Stan Efferding's vertical diet, which is interesting in some ways. I don't think he incorporates all the muscle, all the organ meats and stuff, but there is a role for that. Like if people are really trying to gain weight and really want to push mTOR, you could even incorporate white rice, and people freak out. Oh my God, it's not carnivore. Yeah, it's not, but white rice without the husk is going to have less arsenic, and it's a fairly benign thing in some sense for some people. If we're just looking for an insulin push, or if people just wanted to stay more quote unquote carnivore, they could try honey. I mean, at this point, we're probably splitting hairs, but I think you can make arguments that honey is kind of carnivorous. It's not a plant. It's made by animals. That would be an mTOR signal. Eat some honey, and you're going to get that. I would favor that over dairy. I'm just not a fan of dairy. I think that it's really short-circuiting satiety mechanisms, and I don't think it's a great thing with the casein and the whey. And I would encourage everyone to try some time off of it and see if they feel better. But
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I don't have specific research talking about whey and the mTOR signal. I've just heard people talk about whey as very fast digesting and highly insulinogenic in the past. So that's what made me think of it.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to look into that. I'm not sure. That would be interesting if there's a unique mechanism for the dairy as maybe it is. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think it's totally possible that it could be insulinogenic, which in the setting of people doing a carnivore diet who don't want that might be a real negative too. That might be a real reason not to eat cheese and dairy on a carnivorous diet, because most people don't want that insulin spike, or they need to realize that. I think we just need to know when we're targeting insulin and why we're doing it and what that means for us. But the other thing that I've heard people say, I mean, I think that it's possible to gain weight on a carnivorous diet, if it were not possible to gain weight on a carnivorous diet, then it would be the craziest thing ever. And we would, both be famous right now, I think it's just a matter of caloric surplus and metabolic stimulus, or excuse me, I should say like weight or resistance stimulus. If we want to gain weight on a carnivorous diet, we just probably need to eat more fat. And I would recommend people use things like tallow, but if you increase the fat and you give yourself a stimulus, weightlifting, I believe people will gain muscle mass. But if they're really having trouble with that, they could consider something like a carbohydrate, like rice or something, and you kind of have to ask yourself, what are your goals? Are your goals longevity? Yeah. Are your goals mental clarity? Are your goals to bulk up and get super huge? What do you need those muscles for in the first place? But, some people are really skinny, and if people are like really skinny and really want to gain weight, then I think you have to look into issues of like, why are you not gaining weight in the first place? Is there something going on in your gut? Is there malnourishment? Is there other deficiencies? Because I think most people should be able to get to a moderate amount of muscle mass. But yeah, to get to the level of like a professional bodybuilder, many of them are using, hormones to do that. But to really, really probably pack on like maximum muscle, I don't think we know, Sean Baker's a pretty muscular guy, but it may be individual.
Yeah. I certainly don't think, carnivore is optimal for building muscle, but I would never argue that you can't build muscle on carnivore. Lots of people do it and seem to build muscle even without exercise, just from the increased protein and nutrients. And flipping the script on that, Paul, what about people who want to lose weight on carnivore? They seem to be eating a lot. Maybe they're already let's assume they're already focusing on nutrient density. So let's check that box. What would you suggest to them? Do they need to start counting calories? How do you get, your clients, or in general, what advice would you give for people trying to lose weight on carnivore?
If you want to lose weight on carnivore, this goes back to the Ted Naiman hat tip. I think you just limit your fat, and you don't want to eat zero fat because that will give you rabbit starvation, but it's very hard to gain weight on protein. And so if people want to lose weight on a carnivorous diet, all things being equal and assuming an adequate amount of nutrients in their foods, I would simply think about adjusting the fat to protein macros in favor of protein. Generally what I do in my daily diet, because I am not looking to lose weight, and going back to what we were saying earlier, I should mention that I did not lose muscle when I did carnivore. I've not seen people lose muscle. Generally what I've seen, like you said, is people gaining muscle. But if people, I don't want to lose weight. I'm pretty lean already. So I generally probably do about 60-40 protein to fat in terms of grams in a day. Sometimes it might be 70-30 or maybe 60-40 probably, or even 50-50. But if people want to go more toward fat loss, I would push that even further, 80-20, protein to fat in a day. And that's going to be incredibly satiating.
And that's grams, not calories. Just
that's grams. Yeah.
Because that would be a ton of calories of protein to have 80% protein by calorie.
That's grams. So, if you're doing 80-20, and maybe that's not viable, maybe it's more like 75-25 or something, or even 70-30. But if you're doing, 80% protein by grams and 20% fat by grams, it's going to readjust, because every gram of fat is 9 calories per gram. So you're going to have, a certain amount, you're going to have probably at least 30+% of your calories are going to be from fat still. So I don't think people should do low fat diets. I don't think people should not cut out fat completely, because you'll feel horrible because your body will not run on protein. But that is what I would recommend. Or, at the risk, I don't want people to deprive themselves, but, increasing fasting windows, time restricted eating are also quite helpful for the weight loss. And the weight loss is very, very doable. But again, if people are interested in weight loss, get rid of dairy. For sure. Get rid of dairy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess if someone came to you, Paul, and I don't know if this has happened yet, but I imagine it will as you're gaining more and more stardom in carnivore. If someone came to you and said, I'm doing carnivore, I haven't lost weight yet, I guess how long I imagine it would take a while for you to be like, first, number one, how long have you been doing this? 2, do you feel like your body is still healing some underlying, autoimmune issues, and focus on that first? 3, cut out inflammatory foods, dairy, processed meats, things like that, then like maybe the 10th thing is then if all else fails and you're eating mindfully and you're eating to satiety and you're eating nutrient density, then scale down the fat? Or would you be a little more aggressive with it?
I think that's totally reasonable. There are so many things that are going to come into that equation, and I think it's definitely legitimate to think about doing all those things first. You got to think about micronutrients. You got to think about all that stuff in the context of all this. But people should not have a lot of problems losing weight on this diet. They really should not. If they're not losing weight on this diet, I would wonder, is there underlying inflammation? Is there something else going on? Is there a major thyroid issue? These are the things we need to check, and why it's good to work with a physician. I do that on all my patients. I want to know what their thyroid status is. Is this person profoundly hypothyroid? Like, oh, in that case, we've got bigger issues. We need to deal with your thyroid first, right? So it's complicated. And if people are not losing weight on this diet, I would say, okay, be careful, don't overdo it, but, work with somebody to kind of look through that and give a little more detail.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to preface it with, a lot of folks try carnivore for a month and maybe they're just eating steaks and they're still eating dairy and, they've deprived themselves for a long time. So they'll have some initial weight gain. It could even be from lean tissue. And then they'll drastically say, okay, I'm going to start eating chicken breast. And so I wouldn't want someone to do that. And I think you'd probably agree.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. You don't just want to be eating chicken breasts.
Great. Well, Paul, this has been an absolute pleasure. Love speaking with you. I think folks will get a ton out of this, and hopefully we touched on some new concepts and topics that won't just be repetition from other shows you've done. Where can folks find out more about you? Any links you want to provide?
Yeah, great. It's been so much fun talking. It's been awesome. I hope it is. I on all the podcasts I do, I always think like, what am I going to talk about this time that's going to be new? So it's fun to bring in some of the mTOR stuff that's new. But
Good.
People can go to my website. It's paulsaladinomd.com. That's a little bit about my private medical practice. I do see patients privately. I'm going to be opening a private practice in San Diego starting in June. I see patients virtually now via Skype and Zoom. So if people want to work with me, they can email me at paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. My last name is spelled Saladino, like salad and dinosaur. There's no small amount of irony in that. And then on social media, I'm on Instagram at paulsaladinomd. I'm on Twitter at mdsaladino. I am on Facebook at Paul Saladino MD. I have a YouTube channel. People should definitely check that out. I'm always trying to put out videos. Those are a little harder for me to put out because I try to make them really good with lots of science and content. That is at Paul Saladino MD, but I assure you, and anyone listening, that I'm going to be putting out more YouTube videos in the future. And then I am on Patreon at Paul Saladino MD if people want to support my work there. But generally, if people want to reach out to me and connect, the best way is directly through email at paulsaladinomd@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on the show today, Paul, and I'll definitely link to all that in the show notes at carnivorecast.com, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's been super fun, man.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.